in an anti-Biden jurisdiction or venue decided to prosecute former President Biden, which I think would be a mistake. But he would have to, he meaning former President Biden, would have to defend himself, wouldn't he?
Yes,
And suppose he won, he'd still have to pay his lawyer, wouldn't he?
that's true.
Are
And
lawyers cheap?
only those of us who teach
No,
law.
strike that. I know they're cheap. Are they inexpensive?
No, they're not.
So President Biden could spend millions of dollars,
That's true.
even if he won.
Yes, sir.
Now, let's suppose after that trial was finished, another ambitious district attorney and another venue or another jurisdiction decided to do the same thing. And then another, and then another. Can you understand what the court was talking about when it said we can't allow the court system to have a chilling effect on a president, any president, in making these decisions? Can you understand that?
What happens when the rules used against one president could eventually be turned against the other side? Senator John Kennedy just asked a question that every American should be paying attention to. Before we break it down, hit that like button, subscribe, and stay with me because this hearing raises some serious questions about presidential immunity, political prosecutions, and whether our justice system is being applied consistently.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here. Professor Mascott, this case that we're talking about, Trump v. United States, it was before the United States Supreme Court because the Biden administration decided to criminally prosecute former President Trump. Is that correct?
Yes, Senator.
And in fact, President Biden's lawyer actually asked for expedited review and an expedited decision by the Supreme Court. Is that correct?
Yes, the prosecution would have found expedited review helpful.
When the court handed down its opinion, well, strike that. The title of our hearing is, quote, "When the president does it, that means it's not illegal." And Chairman Durbin explained what he meant by that, but I just want the record to be clear. Did the Supreme Court, in its opinion, ever say, quote, "When the president does it, that means it's not illegal"?
No, that doesn't
Okay.
appear in the opinion.
All right. At the oral argument of this case, President Biden's lawyer actually conceded, did he not, that core functions of a president should have absolute immunity?
Yeah, I do think there's agreement that core functions should have immunity.
In fact, President Biden's lawyer said, quote, "Core functions can't be regulated at all."
That's correct.
Close quote.
Yes.
Okay. What is forum shopping?
Forum shopping is the act of trying to find a court that you think is going to rule favorably to you.
Does it go on in the United States?
Many folks think that it does.
Yeah, it does. It's hard to stop. Let's just stipulate for a moment that America's withdrawal from Afghanistan was not a model of efficiency. People died, including Americans. Can you imagine a scenario with respect to President Biden, now former President Biden? Can you imagine a scenario in which a district attorney in a jurisdiction that repeatedly voted overwhelmingly against President Biden and whose voters did not like President Biden? Can you imagine a scenario in which an ambitious district attorney, after President Biden is out of office, could bring a charge against former President Biden for criminal negligence in the death of Americans. Can you imagine that?
Well, Senator, that would be very troubling, and so that's one of the things.
But can you imagine it happening?
I could imagine district or attorneys wanting to bring such an action, sure.
I mean, now that we've decided that former presidents can be prosecuted, this current case before us is the first instance, but I fear it's not going to be the last. Now, let's suppose this ambitious district attorney in an anti-Biden jurisdiction or venue decided to prosecute former President Biden, which I think would be a mistake. But he meaning former President Biden, would have to defend himself, wouldn't he?
Yes,
And suppose he won, he'd still have to pay his lawyer, wouldn't he?
that's true.
Are
And
lawyers cheap?
only those of us who teach
No,
law.
strike that. I know they're cheap. Are they inexpensive?
No, they're not.
So President Biden could spend millions of dollars,
That's true.
even if he won.
Yes, sir.
Now, let's suppose after that trial was finished, another ambitious district attorney in another venue or another jurisdiction decided to do the same thing. And then another, and then another. Can you understand what the court was talking about when it said we can't allow the court system to have a chilling effect on a president, any president, in making these decisions? Can you understand that?
Absolutely. The risk of facing that would certainly significantly impact how a president would make decisions in office, and that's the last thing we want.
All right, let's zoom out.
Watching Senator John Kennedy question the professor in this hearing, one thing immediately stands out. He wasn't simply asking about legal theory. He was testing whether the principles being discussed would still make sense if the political circumstances were reversed. Kennedy begins with the Supreme Court case involving former President Donald Trump and points out that the Biden administration pursued the prosecution and even sought expedited Supreme Court review. He then makes an important clarification. The Supreme Court did not literally say, when the president does it, that means it's not illegal. That's important because political debates often become distorted when complicated court decisions are reduced to slogans. Kennedy then focuses on something much bigger, what happens when presidents can face criminal prosecution after leaving office. Here's where his questioning gets particularly interesting. Kennedy asks the professor to imagine an ambitious prosecutor in a jurisdiction strongly opposed to Joe Biden. Suppose that prosecutor decided to investigate Biden after he left office over controversial decisions made during his presidency. Then imagine another prosecutor doing the same thing somewhere else, followed by another and another. Even if Biden ultimately won every case, he would still have to spend enormous amounts of money defending himself. And that is the point Kennedy is making. This isn't necessarily about whether a particular president deserves criticism. Presidents should absolutely be accountable for unlawful conduct. The real question is whether the threat of endless politically motivated prosecutions could influence how any president makes difficult decisions while in office. The professor ultimately acknowledges that such a threat could create a chilling effect. And frankly, that's a point Americans across the political spectrum should take seriously. Because today's political opponent could be tomorrow's precedent. If Democrats create a legal weapon that Republicans can later use against Democrats, or Republicans create one that Democrats later use against Republicans, eventually the entire system becomes unstable. That's why constitutional principles should not depend on which political party controls the White House. The video then turns to another controversial issue involving the nominee's stated commitment to original public meaning. In simple terms, that approach generally focuses on understanding constitutional language, principle, and asks whether it should apply to every president. The same goes for judicial philosophy. A nominee shouldn't simply repeat impressive legal phrases. Senators have a responsibility to ask difficult follow-up questions and determine whether the nominee's philosophy actually holds together when confronted with complicated cases. That's why hearings like this matter. The power of the federal judiciary affects every American, regardless of political party. Judges interpret laws, resolve constitutional disputes, and make decisions that can have consequences for businesses, families, government agencies, and individual rights. So when Senator Kennedy pushes a nominee on these issues, Americans should pay attention. You don't have to agree with every word Kennedy says to recognize the value of asking uncomfortable questions. And here's the biggest lesson from this hearing. Constitutional protections should not become partisan weapons. If presidential immunity is necessary to prevent political retaliation, then that principle should protect Republican and Democratic presidents alike. If a president commits genuinely criminal conduct outside protected official actions, there should be lawful mechanisms for accountability. But turning every policy dispute into a potential criminal prosecution could create a dangerous precedent. The goal shouldn't be protecting politicians from accountability. The goal should be protecting the rule of law from political retaliation. That's the distinction Americans need to understand. So what do you think? Did Senator Kennedy expose a legitimate contradiction, or do you think his questions went too far? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more straightforward breakdowns of congressional hearings, constitutional battles, and the political arguments shaping America, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications.